When I was in the 7th grade, I was living in Richmond, Virginia. I was best friends with a guy whose parents ran a dental clinic way out in VAR. Now, they lived in Richmond, but had a small house with a ton of land near the practice, where one parent would go stay and work there while the other looked after the house in Richmond. They would switch every week. My friend and I loved going out there on weekends. The land was beautiful and super explorable. Now, it was a really beautiful day. We'd been having the time of our lives riding dirt bikes through miles of trails through the woods before deciding to hop off the bikes and then walk deeper off the beaten path. We walked straight into the woods for quite a while, probably several miles into the woods that certainly nobody had been there for quite some time. We all know the eerie feeling that can occur when you're deep in the woods. Things seem kind of off and quiet. You feel your own presence. Now, we'd both stopped talking at one point, and I think we both felt it when we come across a wooden structure. It was clearly a dwelling and clearly hadn't been lived in for decades upon decades. It was very well built. Seriously, it looked like it was built into an almost frontier style, but it was still very much standing. That's when it happened. The deep silence was pierced with something that I can only describe as a banshee scream. It came from each direction at once and physically hurt our ears. We turned and ran. As we ran, we hear the entire building behind us collapse in a grand fashion. The scream is now supplemented with the splintering wood being torn apart and falling to the ground. We never looked back as we ran. Being a 13-year-old boy, I was much braver than my current 21-year-old edition. We ran for a while, caught our breath and immediately went back. I seriously can't even imagine having those brass balls today. I don't even know what we were expecting to find, but it was creepy. There it was, perfectly untouched. The building we heard that sounded like it had just come down like a freight train, almost like it had never been touched. We entered. There were dirty floors and some old handmade furniture, like chairs and a chest of drawers. Those were immediate signs. We walked through a doorway and were greeted with the sight of what I can only describe as piles of rotting, blood-stained clothing, and 3 nooses hanging over a beam in the ceiling. We ran almost as fast as the first time, wordless, to our dirt bikes, rode home and didn't sleep a wink that night. I do believe in the supernatural, and I see no logical explanation for what we both saw, even to this day now. In 2009, I was going through some personal problems. I had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and I was stuck in that situation for the meantime. It was stressful and upsetting, so when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend of camping and fishing, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, lots of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great there. We ended up setting up our camp on what was probably farmers' fields. I'm guessing we were trespassing on our part. We were bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a great night. We turned in just before midnight and shared a tent. Now my buddy had fallen asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably about 1:30 AM. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remembered was being woken up by a high-pitched yiping sound. I was kinda groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yiping was constant and sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening, and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried to ignore it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet away from our tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a small dog, but what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have an anxiety disorder, so I was prone to worrying about these type things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake. He was. The noise woken him too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters with. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot. Maybe that would scare it off. So he unzipped the tent and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and said, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude. It's a dude." Normally I would have thought he was messing with me because I'm a big wimp and don't even watch horror films, but I've never seen somebody look that scared, so I knew that he really wasn't messing with me. The weird yiping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyway, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap to make sure he's not losing his mind. At this point I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing, I felt terrible, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dark. That's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms length away from the tent. He was swaying a little, wearing a baseball cap. What made it truly awful and really creepy was that he was wearing women's lanier. That's when I knew that there was something very wrong with this guy, especially if he was making the sounds that I heard. After I pulled my head back inside my tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at him to go away. So my buddy started, "Excuse me, can you go away, we're trying to sleep." And then the noise stopped. It was dead silent. That's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside of the tent though, but we didn't waste time. We started yelling again and saying that we're gonna call the cops. With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, sounding like he was going towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sight of sunlight. That's when we hightailed it out of there. So normally, we wouldn't go into houses that they were building because we figured it probably wasn't safe. We were kids though, and eventually curiosity got the better of us and we went inside one. It was in the early stages of construction, so basically just a house frame and foundation. We hung around it for a bit and realised that there was nothing fun about half-built houses, so we headed home. About 2 hours after we got home, we hear sirens and we look out and see a fire truck heading into the woods. The fire dep made sure nobody went into the woods and there was a small crowd of people formed by the entrance. We asked around for a bit and eventually we found a fireman who told us that the house was burnt down. Turns out that this was the house that we're in no less than 2 hours ago, and it was an arson. Up in the hills behind where I went to high school, there was this house in the woods which apparently a real life witch lived in. We always heard rumours of people driving around at night and seeing a woman standing in the middle of the road. Allegedly, some guys had found the house and brought a bucket of golf balls to throw at it. They drove home, went to sleep, and woke up to find the bucket of balls sitting on their porch. It was just loads of stupid urban legend stuff like that, but we were interested, so we decided to investigate. So one night, because we're a bunch of 17-year-old idiots, we decided to check it out for ourselves. To get out there, you have to drive up into these windy roads, turn down this long dirt driveway, park your car and walk the rest of the way because a giant mound of dirt blockaded the road. After walking for a bit, you come to a small patch in the woods. Small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Now to one of the trees next to the path there was a handwritten old sign saying no trespassing. My buddy Chris takes one look at the sign and says, "Well, that's a load of crap," and throws it on the ground. We started walking down the trail and it immediately became pitch black. You could barely see your hand in front of your face. Granted, it was in the middle of the night, but the tree cover was so intense that our eyes weren't adjusting very quickly. So your heart was racing. You were pretty on edge. We then see maybe 100 feet in front of us, an old parked car. It's been there for ages and all the windows are bust out. There was another car maybe 50 yards down the trail from that one, and it didn't even have glass. We opted to checking out that one. The trees suddenly opened up into a clearing and we could actually see one another. Not very well though. We then realised that about 30 feet in front of us, there was the old house there. It was in a terrible state. It had been abandoned for a long time. I'd be surprised if that thing had running water or electricity within like the last 10 years, maybe 30. It looked like there were trash bags all over the porch though. There was also these weird handmade figurines everywhere from sticks that looked like those from the Blair Witch Project. Chris touches my shoulder and says, "Drop 11, go knock on the door." Are you kidding me? Yeah, go knock on the door. I knew this was terrifying, but I didn't want to disappoint them. Alright. I got up to it, and I went to do a light knock. Hesitated for maybe 15 seconds. I got my courage back and just pounded on it for a few seconds. I waited another 30 or so for an answer, but I got nothing. I heard all of my friends making noises behind me, obviously trying to scare me. Idiots, I thought to myself. I then turn around, and I see that all my friends are gone, wildly falling back down the trail. Idiots. The fact that I'm now alone in the dark, standing on an alleged witch's porch hits me like a wrecking ball. I hightail out of there like I've never ran before. I catch up with my friends and they all look terrified. My friend then points to the no trespassers sign, and it was now hanging on the tree again. Everybody piles into my car and I skid into the dirt to pull away, but as I do so, Brandon screams and points. Back of the house, you can now see a dark figure standing in one of the windows that was not there before. I was camping in the Florida Keys one winter. I managed to survive the large snakes and even larger alligators as well as the scorpions. They would get in my shoes at night, but one experience happened that I'm never going to forget. My campsite was next to an old rocky quarry which had filled with water and made a good place for swimming and getting water from. There was also an old dump site close to the quarry with piles of stoves and fridges and other junk. It had to have been there for a while, but nothing new had been added to it for a long time. One day, a fellow shows up and tells me that they're going to clear up the dump and burn some of the junk, so I'd better move my tent. So I gathered up all of my belongings and moved a few 100 yards back into the woods. That day they started burning the garbage and I thought nothing of it until I climbed into my tent that night. As soon as it got dark and I was falling asleep, my tent became covered in hundreds of rats. I figured that they'd all come from the fire. They were horrible. There were so many. They stayed up on my tent and started climbing up ropes and stuff. I decided to start a fire and stayed up all night hoping that they wouldn't return. They seemed to be gone, so the next night I stayed in the same place thinking they'd moved on to another dump site or something, but no. As soon as it got dark, they all returned and seemed to bring some of their friends, as it seemed there were even more now. I again shook them off the tent and got a fire going. When the morning came, I packed up my tent and headed for a new place free from those rats. I was worried some of them might have rabies. As I was walking towards the highway, wondering if I should return to the same spot or try and find another, there on the highway near the place I was a dead 11-foot alligator which had crawled out from the mangroves only a few feet from where I'd been camping previously. When I was young, my dad lived in an old log cabin about 15 miles west of the Cerrendon, WY, in the foothills of Bighorn Mountains. Every summer when I was visiting, we would go up into the mountains backpacking and fishing for 2 days every weekend. We would park our truck, hike into a remote area, fishing for trout along the way, and make camp wherever we ended up. We encountered a number of strange and creepy things and got into some more scary situations with wildlife, but the one that sticks out with me the most was an ancient abandoned camp we found. We were hiking down a very steep slope to get into an area of the creek that had been dammed up by beavers. I was hoping I could catch some big trout, so I quickly climbed out onto a ledge and was looking for a way down when I saw a stock and an ancient old rusty rifle sticking out of a tree. This is where the tree had actually grown around the barrel. It was about 10 inches above the ground. My dad and I climbed down to check it out, and we found a small cave at the base of the rock formation, only about 12 inches deep, which would make a nice natural shelter, but a really terrible place to set up a long-term camp. Inside we found a bunch of really old stuff, 3 heavy gauge unopened cans of food, a very old cast iron pot that had rusted holes throughout the middle of it, a crusty old saddle and bridge set, and a very deteriorated heavy wool blanket rolled up and tied with a leather belt. We unwrapped the blanket and found several personal items, including a rusty old cap. There was an old revolver, as well as some rounds. There was a powder horn with no black powder in it, tarnished old cartridges, a straight razor, and most upsetting was a shirt with holes in it, and it was obvious it was blood-stained. As we stood there thinking about what all of this meant, it occurred to me how remote this place was, and even in the time of July 1985, and the fact that whoever owned the shirt had been very injured previously, stuck on a steep slope in the middle of absolutely nowhere, is when I got chills down my spine. The only thing that somewhat dated this fateful campsite was a pistol and rifle. Both were made somewhere in the 1870s according to my father. There's no way to ever know what happened to the man who owned all of this stuff, but the fact that he or someone he knew was obviously shot twice with either a gun or arrows, all of his belongings were sitting right there where he left them possibly over 100 years ago. It was unlikely that he would have left this area alive. Discovering what amounts to a 100-year-old crime scene in a very remote area gives me sadness. It upsets me a lot knowing just how hopeless and alone this guy must have felt when he died. My family and I were camping on a lake in central Texas on a week with very few people around. Our spot was on the edge of the camp next to the woods, and very close to the edge of the lake. We were playing Pictionary by the campfire the first night we were there, and when I see a light over by the lake, I didn't think too much of it. I was still focusing on the game when another went by, and at the same speed following the same line. At that point, I felt a little bit strange, but still wasn't too worried about it. After that, another went by. I then pointed it out to my dad, as he noticed it as well. We walk out past the campfire and campground's lights to get a better view of what these are. They continue to fly by it over the lake, going at the same speed, staying at the exact same distance from each other. They were yellow reddish orbs. They were coming with no sound. Now my whole family is watching in awe and disbelief. After about 15 go by, the last one is chased by a white ball of light. That was much closer than the rest. We didn't talk about it much after discussing what it could be, but when we got back home from the trip, my mum looked it up, and she found that there is also other reports of this from people a few miles up from our campsite. To this day, nobody has an idea what it could be. I went out camping with a summer program when I was 16, 12 other guys being managed by 4 adult men, and we were having a great time. S'mores, hot chocolate, campfire stories, the works. We all had to be in our tents, either asleep or quiet by 11. Now I shared my tent with 2 other guys. We were just staying up talking, typical teenage guy stuff. As one of the guys is talking, I started to hear heavy breathing nearby, like somebody had just been running and was trying to catch their breath. I ignored it and kept listening. I figured that I'm just kind of hearing weird stuff where I'm tired, or that it's one of the guys messing around with us. Then we hear, "Please help me," from outside. It didn't sound like anybody we knew, and it sounded like an older person out of breath. We all went dead silent and listened to this guy breathe, then ask again with a whimper at the end. Now I don't know what possessed this guy to do this, but one of the guys grabbed a flashlight, unzipped the flap, and had a look around. We then see just a pair of bare old scabbed legs just standing there. It looked like this guy's been walking around for a while. He just kept asking for help, staring at us. We're all paralysed with fear. Somebody mentions, "Keep going down the trail, there's a ranger up there." The guy stopped breathing and said, "No, not rangers, they keep me here." It was at this point that somebody else finally spoke up and said, "How long have you been out here? What happened? Are you okay?" The guy didn't answer and simply ran off into the woods. I once went camping up in the Apocaly National Forest. Me and some buddies were all sitting around a fire talking to each other. As it got a bit later, we kept hearing things landing around the ground all around us. There were rocks being thrown at our tents and towards the fire. Nothing too absurd. It could have been hooligans nearby in a campsite, but looking around the area, we saw nothing. Anyway, it eventually stopped and we got back into our tents. A few hours later, we heard this ear-piercing sound that sounded as if a woman was screaming while running for our campsite, but much raspier. It was very unsettling. It's the most scariest thing that's ever happened in my life. What creeps me out though, is there's no explanation to this. When I was hiking as a kid along a coastal national forest area with my friend and his dad, I went along down an overgrown side of the trail to pee. I noticed a stench from the main trail that we figured was a dead animal somewhere nearby, and it was getting overpowering as I went a short distance down the trail. I stopped around a tree to do my business and found some trash scattered around the base of it and a cardboard sign leant against a tree that read, "Come find me," with an arrow pointing further down the overgrown trail. At this point the stench was so powerful that I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't pee with my mind freaking out and all of these weird images going through my head of what it could possibly be. So I went back to the main trail and didn't say anything to my friend or his dad about what I'd seen until I couldn't hold my pee anymore and asked his dad to stop to pee again. When we got back to town, he called it into the sheriff. Now I don't know what they found. If anything, I hope it is only some dead animals, but maybe it was something a lot worse. A few friends and I do a yearly camping trip in the Insomniak National Forest in northern Michigan. One year we decided to try a new spot by the river for easier access to fishing, kayaking, etc. Needless to say, this spot was very remote. We had to backpack in and drag our kayaks through the woods just to get there. Now this is all state land, so it's basically find a spot and set up wherever. It was early June at the time, so we weren't worried about people out there or hunters or anything like that. We arrived during the day, and after our first day there, we set up our tents and hit the river for the rest of the afternoon. We got back right before it got dark and started a fire. Now everything is peaceful. It's a really nice night, until all of a sudden a big glowing fire appears about 300 yards away. We started hearing chanting and look a little closer and noticed the glowing seems to be getting closer. People appear to be burning across. About 5 minutes later, gunfire erupts. And I mean erupts. There must have been at least 10 different guns going off just non-stop. The gunfire eventually stops and some chanting continues. There's at least 20 of them there. We left all our stuff and got out of there real quick. We went back the next day and got our tents and found that nobody was in the area where we camped that night. To this day, we have no idea what it was. It could have been some kind of weird cult or just some weirdos out in the woods. Really creepy, especially considering how far out we were. A few years ago, I was on a mission trip in Kenya. We were camping out in the bush for a few days. It was pretty uneventful. One night, the moon was either full or just randomly super bright, and it made the sides of my tent kind of transparent to the outside, if that makes sense. So if something were to walk by, I would see its silhouette from inside my tent. You might know what I mean. So I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of quiet feet scuffling nearby. When I lifted my head, I saw the silhouettes of a person creeping past my tent. He was wearing a large, terrifying looking headdress which, after I described the incident to my team leader, was to grab with a witch doctor. I never slept that night. I was out camping in the Cthulhu Valley on the Big Islands of Hawaii. After staying up late into the night and encountering 2 large centipedes in and around my tent, I decided to pack up and leave at about 4 AM. On my exit, I was almost towards the top of the valley and took a break. I sat down and looked far along the coast several valleys further. I was now looking at where I was camping, and I noticed 15 to 20 little flickering torches moving along the jagged cliff edge. Those valleys are for very experienced hikers only. Now, I don't believe in the Hawaiian night marches, but I don't know of any kind of hikers doing that treacherous journey during an hour like that in the dark using torches instead of headlamps. My friend and I were visiting the Mount St. Helens mountain. We were sitting in the car parked up in an area eating. It was raining and the windows were a bit foggy and it was getting dark. There was a knock on my window. Multiple knocks. We were both startled, looked at each other. There was no one else there. I looked outside the car and there was literally nothing, and we were parked on the side of an embankment. I rolled down my window and looked out. There was no one. We then sped off. It was super terrifying. Later we read in the park flyer that a man died there during an eruption. This still creeps me out thinking of it because I'm sure it's his spirit. When I was through hiking the Appalachian Trail, at one point in New York, I was trying to catch up to some friends by doing big miles. So I ended up hiking day and night sometimes, camping in pine forest between shelters a few hundred yards off the trail for privacy. After I got my tent all set up, I realised there were basically no good tree branches to hang my food bag from. I wandered around for about 15 minutes to a close radius to my tent, trying to find somewhere, but I had no luck because the type of branches and tree weren't strong enough. But I knew there was a chance of bears, because it was close to some parks where people always leave food out. Now eventually I was able to find a tree just 15 feet from my tent. It had one branch, but that would do. As soon as I get my food bag up, I crash hard and start having nightmares about being chased by a banshee. I don't normally get nightmares often, but this was a vivid one. There were very distinctive sounds as if she-demon makes repeated swoops at me out of the sky. I eventually wake up in a full sweat, glad to realise it is just a dream. And then I hear the sound directly outside of my tent at max volume. My god, was I afraid. It started happening at semi-regular intervals and become clear it was nearby, but not actively downwards towards my tent. Eventually I peeped out from under my vista tube towards my food bag. And sure enough, there was a big burly black bear jumping up towards a bag that was hanging about 12 feet off the ground. This is probably the most scary thing that I've ever seen. It gone on for about 2 hours. I was clutching my knife and trekking pole in the hope that I could defend myself, but really, it would have been futile had the bear come for me. Fortunately, he left after a while. Now, the scary thing for me is that nightmare transitioned into a reality. The sounds I was hearing outside were influencing my dream, and I thought the dream itself was scary enough. So I was in Zimbabwe on a hike with 2 adults and about 12 teenagers. We were not following a path and just using a map on a 3-day trip to these waterfalls. We come to a dam with a 20 to 30 meter area of beach sand. This is very unnatural and caused a lot of discussion. Where the beach stopped, there were these granite boulders and large rocks. It was very attractive and we decided to set up camp early. 1 hour later, somebody finds this cave. The mouth was small and we had to go down on all fours to get in, but we're inside now. Wow, was it beautiful. It was 3 meters high and 10 meters long. There was a crack in the ceiling that allowed a beam of light to come through. Naturally, the majority of us wanted to sleep in there. So at 1 AM, I wake up and I'm being shaken by the leader, who is telling everybody to get out of there, since there's a leopard outside and we've accidentally gone inside his lair. At first I was sure this was a prank, because the guy telling me is always joking, so I simply rolled over and started to sleep again. The next thing I know, my sleeping bag is being ripped off me and I'm ordered to get out now, or I am responsible for myself. I'm not joking. I then realised he wasn't kidding and scurried out. We all then sat as close as we could to the fire as we watched the eyes of the leopard pacing up and down in the dark. Now, we're already in a bad situation. He has water to our backs and he's in front of us, so we're stuck. Fortunately for us, the leopard didn't like the activity and moved off. This is probably the most lucky that I've ever got in my life.